The wind was cold that night, and the air smelled like snow was coming soon. In the small town at the edge of the forest, most people were already inside their warm homes. The streetlights gave off a soft yellow glow, but beyond them the trees stood tall and dark like giant shadows watching over the town. Jack Miller was outside his cabin stacking firewood beside the porch while his little daughter Emily was sleeping inside under her warm blanket. Jack was a single father, and he worked hard every day to take care of her and make sure she had everything she needed. He liked nights like this because they were quiet and peaceful, and he could hear the soft sound of the wind through the trees. But tonight something felt different, and it was not the cold air that made him pause and listen. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, a faint sound coming from deep in the woods. It was a voice, and it sounded like someone was calling for help. Jack froze for a moment, his hand still holding a piece of firewood. He turned his head toward the forest and listened carefully. The voice came again, weak and shaky, almost like it was being carried by the wind. He could not tell if it was close or far away, but he knew it was not something he could ignore. Jack put down the firewood and grabbed his flashlight from a porch. He glanced at the window where the light from Emily's night lamp was glowing softly inside. He thought about her safety, but he also knew that if someone was out there in trouble, he had to help. The voice came again, and now it sounded more desperate. His heart began to beat faster as he stepped onto the narrow path that led into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around him as he walked deeper into the darkness. The crunch of frozen leaves under his boots echoed in the still night. The flashlight beam cut through the blackness, showing patches of snow and twisted roots. He kept moving, listening for the voice guiding him. Each time he heard it, he turned in that direction, moving faster with every step. The forest was quiet except for the sound of his own breathing and the occasional snap of a branch under his foot. Then, without warning, a shape appeared ahead between the trees. It was a woman. She was stumbling forward, her bare feet dirty and cut from the forest floor. Her clothes were torn, and her hair hung loose around her face. Her eyes were wide and filled with fear as she looked at him. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. Jack stepped toward her, holding the flashlight so he could see her better. "What happened to you?" he asked, keeping his voice calm even though he felt a sudden rush of worry. "They are coming," she said, glancing over her shoulder into the darkness. Her hands were shaking, and she looked like she might collapse at any moment. Jack felt a cold chill run down his spine when he heard movement in the distance. It was the sound of branches breaking and footsteps moving quickly through the woods. "Who is coming?" he asked, but she shook her head. "No time, we have to go now," she said, her voice trembling. Jack knew she was telling the truth and that danger was close. He took her arm gently but firmly and turned back toward the path leading to his cabin. As they moved quickly through the forest, Jack kept his ears open for the sound of whoever was following. The footsteps were still there, though they were faint, like someone was trying to move quietly. Jack did not like the feeling in his gut because it told him this was no ordinary situation. The woman was breathing hard and stumbling, but he kept her moving. He could see the glow of his cabin lights through the trees, and that gave him some relief. When they reached the porch, Jack opened the door and guided her inside. Emily was still asleep in her room, unaware of what was happening. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them, but the tension in the air did not fade. Jack locked the door and shut off the porch light so the cabin would be harder to see from the woods. He turned to the woman and asked her name. "Anna," she said softly, still catching her breath. Anna looked toward the window as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Jack stepped closer to the window and peered out into the night. The forest stood silent and still, but he knew better than to trust the quiet. He could still feel eyes watching from somewhere out there in the dark. Whoever was coming for Anna had not given up yet, and they would soon find the cabin. Jack did not know who they were, but he knew one thing for sure. He would not let them get to her or to Emily. The night was far from over, and whatever had started out there in the woods was only the beginning. Anna stood near the door, her hands still shaking as she tried to breathe normally. Her eyes kept moving toward the dark window, like she was expecting something terrible to appear at any second. Jack could see she was exhausted, but fear kept her from relaxing. Emily stirred softly in her room, but did not wake, and Jack was grateful for that, because he did not want her to see the fear on Anna's face or the tension in his own. He moved to the kitchen quietly and poured a glass of water for her. "Here, drink this," he said in a calm voice. Anna took the glass and drank quickly, spilling a little as her hands trembled. Her lips moved like she wanted to speak, but she kept glancing toward the front door and the window again. Jack sat across from her, leaning forward, his eyes steady on hers. "Anna, you need to tell me who is after you," he said slowly. She shook her head, her hair falling over her face. "You do not understand," she whispered. "They are dangerous. They will not stop until they find me." Her voice cracked and her eyes filled with tears. Jack listened to her words, but also to the quiet outside the cabin. He knew the sound of hunters, and the forest had gone too still, like every living thing out there was hiding. Then it came again, a sound from the trees. It was soft at first, like a branch snapping under a careful foot. Jack's body tensed and Anna's eyes widened. He raised a finger telling her to stay quiet. The sound came again, closer now and more deliberate. Whoever was out there was not rushing, but moving slowly, like they were sure of where they were going. Jack moved to the window, but kept to the side so he could see out without being seen. At first he saw nothing, just the thick shadows of the trees. Then a shape moved between them. It was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing that blended into the night. The figure stopped for a moment, as if listening, then continued forward, disappearing behind a pine tree. Anna's breathing grew fast and shallow. "It is them," she whispered. Jack turned back to her and lowered his voice. "How many?" he asked. "3, maybe," for she replied, her voice shaking. "They had dogs earlier, but I lost them near the river." Jack's mind was already working through what he needed to do. He looked toward Emily's room, then back at Anna. He walked to a closet and pulled out a thick blanket and handed it to her. "Stay here, keep quiet, and stay away from the windows," he said. Anna looked at him with fear and confusion. "Where are you going?" she asked. Jack did not answer directly. Instead, he grabbed an old wooden baseball bat from beside the door and set it within easy reach. He did not plan to use it if he could avoid it, but he liked to be ready. The sound of footsteps moved again outside, circling slowly. Jack knew the forest was their advantage, but it could also be his. He had spent years in dangerous places where knowing when to stay. Hidden was as important as knowing when to act. He turned off the small kitchen lamp, leaving only the faint light from the fire in the hearth. Shadows filled the cabin, but his eyes began to adjust. Anna sat very still, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Minutes passed, but each one felt longer than the last. Then there was a knock on the door. It was slow and deliberate. Jack froze in place, his hand hovering near the bat. Anna's eyes went wide with panic. "Do not answer," she mouthed. The knock came again, louder this time, and followed by a low male voice. "We know you are in there. Open the door." Jack's jaw tightened. The voice did not sound like someone asking for help. It sounded like a command. A dangerous one. He motioned for Anna to move toward Emily's room quietly. She obeyed, stepping carefully so the floorboards would not creak. The voice outside spoke again. "We just want to talk." Jack knew that was a lie. He had heard those words before in places far from here, and they never ended well. The sound of boots crunched on the snow as the figure moved away from the front door toward the side of the cabin. Jack slipped quietly to the back door, listening carefully. He could hear at least 2 voices, now one low and one higher pitched, speaking in short sentences, too quiet to understand. They were spreading out. Jack's pulse stayed steady, but every muscle in his body was ready. If they came through that door or window, they would regret it. Anna peeked from the hallway, her eyes wide. "They are going to break in," she whispered. Jack nodded slightly. "Not if I stop them first," he replied in a low voice. The faintest hint of a plan formed in his mind, and it depended on speed and surprise. He stepped closer to the back door and waited. Outside, the sound of footsteps came nearer, and the shadow of a man passed across the frosted window glass. Jack reached for the latch and tightened his grip on the bat. If they wanted to fight, they had just found the wrong cabin. Jack stood in the dark hallway, his grip tight around the bat, his breathing slow and quiet. The cold air leaking in from the back door made the room feel even more tense. Anna stood behind him holding Emily, in her arms the little girl, still half asleep and confused. Jack's eyes moved from the door to the side window, where shadows flickered across the glass. Whoever was out there was not moving fast, they were moving with patience, like hunters who had done this before. The sound of snow crunching under boots grew louder than softer as the men spread out around the cabin. One shadow moved away, disappearing into the trees, while another came closer until it stopped right outside the wall, where Jack stood. Jack's muscles tightened, ready for whatever was about to happen. He turned to Anna, his voice low and steady. "Go to the small room at the back, take Emily with you, and keep her quiet." Anna nodded, holding Emily close as she slipped into the dark hallway, her steps light and careful. Jack waited until the sound of the door closing reached him, before he turned his full attention back to the danger outside. A faint scraping sound came from above, like something sliding against the roof. Jack looked up, and his mind worked fast. They were checking for ways in from every side, maybe even the chimney. He moved quietly to the kitchen window and peeked out through a gap in the curtain. Another man was standing near the porch, his head turning slowly, like he was scanning the area. The man held something in his hand that caught a glint from the moonlight. It was not a flashlight, it was a weapon. Jack's pulse stayed calm, but inside his mind was a storm of decisions. He could wait for them to make the first move, or he could act before they got inside. The memory of Anna's fear and Emily's small sleeping face made the choice clear. He stepped to the closet and pulled out a thick black coat and a wool cap. Then he opened a drawer and took out a small flashlight. Not to see, but to distract. The sound of footsteps moved toward the side of the cabin. Jack eased the back door open just enough to slip outside. The cold bit at his skin, but he moved like a shadow, keeping low and silent. The forest around him was quiet, but he could sense the presence of the men. Years of training had taught him how to feel danger in the air. He spotted the nearest figure about 10 feet away. The man was focused on the cabin, his body turned away from Jack. Jack picked up a small chunk of ice from the ground and tossed it hard into the trees on the opposite side. The sound cracked through the stillness. The man turned his head toward the noise and took a step away from the cabin. That was all Jack needed. He closed the distance quickly and swung the bat low, aiming for the man's legs. The man went down with a muffled cry, his weapon falling into the snow. Jack grabbed it and pushed the man face first into the cold ground. "Stay down, Jack," whispered, his voice sharp and dangerous. Before Jack could secure him, another sound came from the trees. Footsteps fast and heavy. Another man was coming. Jack melted back into the shadows, gripping the stolen weapon tightly. The second man rushed past, not seeing him in the darkness. Jack stepped out behind him and pressed the cold metal against his back. "Do not move," Jack growled. The man froze, his breath turning into white clouds in the air. Jack could hear the other two, still moving somewhere beyond the porch, but he had no time to go after them yet. He forced the second man toward the one lying in the snow, keeping his voice low and steady. The two men stayed on the ground, their eyes wide. "Who sent you?" Jack demanded. Neither answered. "Fine," he said, his tone like ice. He left them there and moved back toward the cabin, his senses sharp for any movement. The porch was empty, but he knew it would not stay that way for long. Inside, Anna peeked out from the hallway, her face pale. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "Not yet," Jack said, "but they will be." He shut the door and bolted it again, keeping the stolen weapon in his hand. Emily was still asleep in the small room, unaware of the danger outside. Jack stood by the window, watching the trees. Somewhere out there, the remaining men were regrouping and planning their next move. The night was not over, and the worst might still be coming. The cabin was quiet, but it was not the calm kind of quiet. It was the heavy kind that made the air feel tight and hard to breathe. Anna sat near the fire wrapped in the thick blanket, her hands still trembling as she looked at Jack, who was checking the windows one by one. The stolen weapon rested on the table within easy reach, and the baseball bat leaned against the wall beside the door. Emily was in the small back room still asleep, and Jack intended to keep it that way for as long as he could. Anna watched him move, and she noticed how he kept low near the walls, how he listened to every small sound outside, how his eyes never stopped scanning. "You are not just a regular dad, are you?" she asked softly. Jack glanced at her, but said nothing as he kept working. Anna leaned forward, her voice lower. "The way you move, the way you look around, you have done this before." Jack finally stopped checking the window and turned toward her, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. "I used to do things in the military," he said, nothing more. "That is not just the military, is it?" she asked, her tone half afraid, half curious. Jack hesitated for a moment, then took a slow breath. "I was a Navy SEAL," he said quietly. The words seemed to hang in the air like the smoke from a fire. Anna's eyes widened. "I knew it," she whispered. Jack looked away toward the dark trees outside. "That was a long time ago," he said, "and I left it behind for a reason." Anna leaned closer, her voice trembling. "They will not stop until I am dead, Jack." Jack met her eyes, and there was no hesitation in his voice. "Then they will have to go through me first." She swallowed hard, and for a moment there was only the sound of the fire popping softly. Jack walked to a small locked cabinet near the corner of the room. He took a key from a chain around his neck and unlocked it. Inside was a small collection of gear that did not belong in a quiet mountain cabin. A combat knife, a coil of rope, a heavy flashlight, and a few other tools that looked worn but well kept. Anna's eyes followed his hands as he placed the items on the table one by one. "You were ready for something like this," she said. "I was ready for the day the past might come back," Jack replied. Outside, the wind picked up and the trees groaned. Jack listened for any sound that did not belong. The men were still out there somewhere. They were not moving in yet, which meant they were either waiting for backup or planning a different way in. Either way, Jack knew they would come again before morning. Anna finally spoke, her voice low and urgent. "I saw something I should not have seen," she said. "I work in a small office, but it is part of something bigger, something bad." She stopped and glanced toward Emily's room, then lowered her voice even more. "I saw them moving weapons. I saw names I was not supposed to see. They found out, and they started following me everywhere. Tonight they almost caught me near the old river bridge, but I ran into the woods." Jack listened, without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she was done, he nodded once. "That explains why they are not giving up," he said. Jack began moving through the cabin with purpose, checking escape routes and testing the locks. He lowered the blinds and pushed the couch in front of the front door, then moved a small dresser to block the side window. Anna watched him work. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am going to make sure they do not get in. And if they do, I will make sure they do not leave," Jack said, his voice steady. Anna pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You sound like you have done this 100 times," she said. Jack did not answer. Instead, he walked to the back door and looked out at the dark line of trees. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. Somewhere out there the men were waiting and watching, but they had no idea who they were up against. Jack turned back to Anna. "If something happens and I tell you to run, you take Emily and go toward the river," he said. "Follow the water until you reach the old mill. Do not stop for anything." Anna nodded, her eyes serious and full of fear. "What about you?" she asked. Jack gave a small half-smile. "I will catch up." The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Jack sat down near the table, his eyes on the window, his hands steady as stone. Anna could feel the tension in the room, like a storm was about to break. Jack Miller might have left his Navy SEAL days behind, but tonight those days had come back to life. And the men outside were about to find out what that really meant. The night air was sharper now, and the wind had grown restless, carrying with it the faint sound of movement beyond the trees. Jack stood by the back door, his hand resting on the weapon he had taken earlier, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Anna sat with Emily in the small room, keeping the girl close, and quiet her ears, straining for any sound that might tell her what was happening. Jack listened with the patience of someone who had done this before, letting the forest speak to him in its own quiet language. Somewhere out there, dry twigs cracked under careful steps, and the snow gave a muffled crunch under heavy boots. They were close again. Jack knew the moment to act had come. Waiting inside would only give them more time to surround the cabin and cut off every escape route. He stepped into the cold, without a word, his boots silent against the snow. The forest wrapped around him, its shadows deep and shifting. Jack kept low, moving from tree to tree, his breath slow and controlled. The moonlight spilled in patches across the ground, lighting narrow paths between the darkness. A figure appeared ahead, moving cautiously, scanning the cabin from a distance. Jack recognized the posture of someone trained. This was no amateur. He tightened his grip on the weapon and took another step forward, using the thick trunk of a pine to hide his approach. The man paused, listening to the night, but Jack was already moving, circling to his side. In one swift motion, Jack stepped out and struck the man hard, the weapon knocking him off balance and into the snow. The man gasped in surprise, but before he could shout, Jack pressed the barrel against his chest. "Do not make a sound," Jack hissed, his voice low and sharp. From deeper in the woods came another sound. Boots running fast. Jack knew the noise would draw the others. He pulled the man up and forced him behind a tree, keeping him in place as he listened. Another figure emerged from the shadows, scanning the area, his head turning sharply when he spotted the first man's footprints. He followed them without realizing Jack was already waiting. Jack moved with precision, stepping out behind him and striking with the butt of the weapon, sending him to his knees in the snow. 2 down, but more to go. The forest was alive now, with quiet signals, the faint clicks of radios, the soft scrape of boots over ice. They were talking to each other, moving in a slow, tightening circle around the cabin. Jack had to thin their numbers before they reached the door. He dragged the 2 stunned men deeper into the trees, leaving them in the cold, their weapons tossed far from reach. Then he melted back into the shadows. A third man appeared, moving quickly toward the back of the cabin. Jack saw the faint gleam of metal in his hand. The man stopped at the edge of the clearing, scanning the cabin for movement. Jack waited until he looked away, then launched forward from the dark, tackling him into the snow with enough force to knock the wind out of him. The man struggled, but Jack's knee pressed into his back, and the cold steel of the weapon touched the base of his neck. "Stay down," Jack ordered, and the man froze, his breath ragged and steaming in the night air. From the front of the cabin came a new sound. A low whistle. It was a signal. Jack knew it meant the last of them was ready to move in. He left the third man face down in the snow and sprinted silently toward the front, using every shadow for cover. The final figure stood near the porch steps, scanning the windows. Jack approached from the side, his steps light and quick. Before the man could react, Jack's hand closed around his wrist, twisting the weapon free. The man swung with his free hand, but Jack ducked and drove his shoulder into his chest, sending him to the ground. For a moment the forest was quiet again, except for the wind. Jack stood over the last man, his breath calm, his eyes scanning the trees for any more movement. There was none. The immediate danger was over, but Jack knew it was only for now. They would not give up that easily. He moved back toward the cabin, his boots leaving faint tracks in the snow. Anna met him at the door, her eyes wide. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "For now," Jack said, his voice steady. "But they will come again, and next time they will bring more." Anna's grip tightened around Emily. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jack looked toward the dark forest, the shadows still deep and waiting. "We make the first move," he said, and there was no fear in his voice, only the quiet certainty of a man who had walked into danger before and walked out again. The night was starting to fade, and the first pale light of morning touched the tops of the trees, but the cold was still sharp, and the forest still felt dangerous. Jack stood at the window, watching the quiet woods, his eyes moving over every shadow, every drift of snow that could hide a threat. Anna sat near the fire, holding Emily, who was finally awake and staring at Jack with wide eyes. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice small. "Not yet," Jack said, his tone calm but firm. He knew the men he had taken down would not stay silent once their friends came looking for them. They would regroup, they would be angry, and they would come back with more numbers. If Jack stayed in the cabin with Anna and Emily, it would only be a matter of time before the walls came down around them. The only way to end it was to go out there and finish it before the sun was high. Anna could see it in his face. "You are going after them," she said, her voice a mix of fear and disbelief. Jack nodded slowly. "If we wait, they will come for all of us," he said. "I am not letting that happen." He walked to the small locked cabinet again, pulling out the rest of the gear he had kept hidden for years. He strapped the knife to his belt, tucked extra ammunition into his coat, and slung a coil of rope across his shoulder. Anna's eyes followed every move. "You left that life," she said quietly. "Why risk going back to it now?" "Because some people need protecting," he replied, "and sometimes the only way to protect them is to make sure the danger never comes back." Emily hugged Anna tighter, and Anna's voice shook. "Please come back," she whispered. Jack gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I will," he said, and then he stepped out into the freezing morning. The forest was still except for the faint rustle of branches. Jack moved quickly, staying low, using the terrain to his advantage. He followed the faint tracks in the snow left by the retreating men. They had headed north toward the ridge where the trees grew thick and the ground sloped steeply down to a frozen creek. It was a good place for an ambush, but Jack knew how to turn that against them. He moved without sound, his breathing controlled, his mind clear. Every step brought him closer until he heard the low murmur of voices ahead. He crouched behind a fallen tree and peered over it. For men stood in a small clearing, two of them, the ones he had left in the snow earlier. They were talking quickly, their faces hard with anger. One of them pointed toward the direction of the cabin, and Jack knew they were planning to move soon. Jack circled wide around them, his steps silent in the snow. From the far side he slipped in close, using the trees for cover. A quick movement, and one man went down, his weapon kicked away into the snow before he could even shout. The others turned in surprise, but Jack was already moving, his strikes fast and precise, knocking another man into the frozen creek bed. The remaining two pulled their weapons, but Jack used the trees as shields, moving between them faster than they could track. A sharp blow to the wrist sent one weapon spinning into the snow. A final tackle sent the last man crashing to the ground, the air knocked out of him. The fight was over in less than a minute. Jack stood over them, his breath steady, his eyes cold. "You will leave this place, and you will never come back," he said, his voice low and sharp. They stared at him, but they could see he meant every word. One by one they got to their feet and stumbled away into the forest, disappearing into the pale light of morning. Jack stayed there for a long moment, listening to the forest, until he was sure they were gone. Then he turned and made his way back toward the cabin. The cold air bit at his skin, but the sight of the small wooden home through the trees made the walk easier. Anna was at the door when he arrived, Emily standing beside her. They both looked relieved and afraid all at once. "It is done," Jack said simply. Anna searched his face for any sign of what had happened, but Jack gave nothing away. Emily ran to him, and he lifted her into his arms. "Are we safe now?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, "at least for now." Anna stepped closer, her eyes shining. "I do not know how to thank you," she said softly. "You do not need to," Jack replied. "You just need to keep moving, keep safe." Anna nodded slowly. "I should go before they change their minds," she said. Jack agreed, though part of him wanted her to stay where he could protect her. He helped her gather a few supplies and walked with her to the edge of the forest. She turned to him once more, her voice low. "I will never forget what you did for me." Jack watched as she disappeared between the trees, the snow swallowing her tracks. Emily slipped her small hand into his, and they stood together watching the morning light spread across the mountains. The danger was gone for now, but Jack knew quiet never lasted forever. Still, he would be ready for whatever came next.